Okay, so we're back with more from 1.2. An important kind of non-argument would be a conditional statement. So what we need to understand here in the context of, well, what is it an argument or not? We need to understand that a single conditional statement is not an argument. So to give an example, of course, we have, if Rick Larson is defeated in the next election, then our congressional district will be represented by a Republican. So just notice here that what we're dealing with is simply a single if, then statement, right? If and then. And so any single conditional statement is not an argument. Where there can be confusion is due to the fact that conditional statements are often used in arguments, right? A lot of arguments use conditional statements, but in this case, by itself, a single conditional statement will not be an argument. How we could turn this into an argument or involve it in an argument would be to add to this statement, by the way, Rick Larson will be defeated in the next election, therefore, our congressional district will be represented by a Republican. If I added those other two items, of course, now we're looking at an argument. But by itself, as what you see here on the screen, it's definitely not an argument. Now, because conditional statements play a very important role in symbolic logic, I just want to kind of take on these two terms here now, antecedent and consequent. Every conditional statement has both an antecedent and a consequent. And just to give you an idea schematically here, we're talking about if A, then C, for example. So in other words, here is the antecedent. And here would be the, I'm not sure you can read that, but you get the idea. The consequent. Okay? So in other words, the antecedent is the part of the conditional statement that comes after the word if. The consequent is the part that comes after the word then, right? So we can identify those pieces here in this example, and we can do the same in the next one, right? If Rick Larson is defeated in the next election, comma, our congressional district will be represented by a Republican. Well, here, right, we don't see the word then. It's been left out, as we often do. But just understand that the antecedent will still be Rick Larson is defeated in the next election, and then the consequent will still be our congressional district will be represented by a Republican, right? Same antecedent and consequent. And in fact, we often express conditional statements in this way, right? Where we actually note the consequent first. Our congressional district will be represented by a Republican, right? So that's the consequent, if Rick Larson is defeated in the next election. So the antecedent comes second there. So what's really important to understand about antecedent and consequent, since we will be using that terminology throughout the quarter, is that the antecedent here always follows the word if, or anything that means if, in fact, okay? So if you have the word if, or some other word, there are others, that mean if, that piece then will be called the antecedent. And then the consequent will follow the word then, if there is a then, or if there's no then, right? It's just the other part of the conditional statement that's not the antecedent. But back to this example, right, a single conditional statement is not an argument. All right, and so finally, we can move on to explanations, the last type of non-argument. And to do that, let me just give you a couple quick examples here of explanations. So we have Mount St. Helens erupted because of building geological pressures deep underneath the Earth versus Mount St. Helens erupted because of harmonic disalignment. Now, both, I'm talking here, by the way, about the big 1980 eruption, right, that took off the top of the mountain. And of course, both of these are attempts to explain why that happened, right? Whether it's because of building geological pressures deep underneath the Earth or because of something I made up called harmonic disalignment, right? Now, explanations and arguments are often confused with one another, and that's for multiple reasons. First of all, there are good and bad explanations, right? I don't know that the first one here qualifies as good, but it's certainly better than the second one, which, again, I just made up, right? So there are good and bad explanations, just like there will be good and bad arguments in a certain sense. So we can evaluate both explanations and arguments. Explanations use indicator words. This is a very serious point of confusion here. They do use indicator words, but of course they aren't arguments, right? So we see the words because in both of these examples over here. Yet, even though those are on the premise indicator list, neither one of these is an argument. They're explanations instead. And finally, explanations and arguments are often confused because they're definitely intertwined. In other words, there are, for example, arguments about explanations, right? For a long time, there was an argument about what's the best explanation for why the dinosaurs died out, right? And scientists had different competing ideas. I think today they've kind of settled on the whole meteorite theory. At any rate, in other contexts, right, people have arguments about what's the best explanation for some phenomena. Also, of course, there are explanations of arguments, as you see here at the end. What kind of person explains how arguments work? Well, me, for example, right? Philosophy instructors would definitely see as one of their tasks to explain how an argument might work. So they're intertwined. So how are we going to be able to tell the difference then between explanations and arguments? Well, here it is, right? Kind of laid out. So explanations will show how or why something is true. In other words, take a claim or a statement that we all know to be true. If you're going to talk about why or how that is true, then you're offering an explanation. Okay? Arguments, on the other hand, as I think we're seeing, arguments always attempt to prove that something is true. So they are attempting to establish that something is true that we don't all already believe. So to give a couple quick examples here, right? We all know the sun rose today. So I can explain why the sun rose today, but I can't argue that it did, right? I can't argue that something is true that you already know to be true. But I could certainly explain why the sun rose today, right? I could talk about what Apollo getting in his chariot, or the Earth revolving around the sun, whatever the case might be. On the other hand, the moral status of the death penalty is not something I could presume that we all quote unquote know, right, about. That is, I can't presume that we all agree, for example, that the death penalty is immoral. And so since there's disagreement about that, I can argue that the death penalty is morally wrong. I couldn't explain why it's morally wrong to a group of people that are in disagreement about that. So as you see here in my parenthetical comment at the end, context here is fairly important as well. And that is because if I were to be, for example, speaking to a meeting of an organization called Amnesty International, an organization that, among other things, is opposed to the death penalty, right? If I were speaking to them, I could presume that they all agree the death penalty is immoral. And in that context, then, I might offer an explanation for why it's immoral. But certainly in the context of this class, right, where I presume we have all kinds of ideas about, again, in this case, the death penalty, I can't presume we all agree, so I can't offer an explanation of why it's immoral. I could simply argue that it's immoral.